Earlier this week, when I sat down to draft out the material for this week's news and analysis episode, I had 3 stories in mind that I wanted to explore. One about the Florida resort, one about the California resort, and one about a beloved cast member. But once again, the news cycle has exploded around just one story, the one focused on Reedy Creek and Disney, so that to understand this story with depth and nuance, it takes a while. Unlike most podcasts, I write out everything to make sure that I've thought through the issues and also so I'm quoting everyone accurately. Typically, I shoot for just over 5,000 words. I start on Monday, usually have a draft by Thursday, revise and maybe record on Friday or Saturday, and then post on Sunday. This week, those 5,000 words were quickly consumed by the ongoing problems between Disney and the state of Florida and how the problems there have expanded this past month. There's literally no newspaper that will run a 5,000-word article. Some magazines will run such an article, but for a typical magazine, that's an in-depth feature story. On our news episodes, I try to give topics the space they need to be fully explained and also to explore how these events might shape the future of the Disney company. That's what we have today. An in-depth look at how events in Florida create a context for Disney developments in the near future. And to do that, this week we're actually over 6,000 words. This discussion does have political elements, as the standoff is largely between Disney and a governor who has signaled that he'll likely run for president. But also I have no ambitions to turn our show into a political podcast or even mention politics outside of our look at Disney. The political elements here in our Reedy Creek material exist only to define Disney's position in the current moment and to examine how local and state policies might shape the way Disney will expand the Florida resort in the near future and also possibly even expand resorts and parks outside of Florida. Years ago, I had imagined that our news and analysis episodes would be a space to relate news pertinent to the Disney company, such as news that wasn't widely presented with depth in most newspapers. But here, rather ironically, we are exploring an issue that is front and center in every newspaper across the country. We are looking at these issues in real time. Neither you nor I know where all of this will end up in a year, but today, we'll jump down into all the trouble and try to sort it out. One more thing, just like last month, we'll probably catch up on those other news stories in about a week or 2. So, if you're ready to get down into all of the details, to look for meaning in this strange combination of theme parks, lawsuits, and political ambitions, here we go. When we last left off, we were moving into very unusual territory, where Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, threatened tax increases on Disney inside of the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, what used to be called the Reedy Creek Improvement District. He also mused that the state might build a prison on land owned by the district. At the very least, a governor insisting that his hand-selected board would raise taxes on business was an unusual look for a Republican hopeful of becoming the party's nominee for president. Raising taxes was something that the Republicans traditionally blame on Democrats. Perhaps worse, these tax increases would be necessary in large part to pay for the district's legal bills as the board gears up for multiple court fights with Disney. This would set up the absurd system in which Disney pays taxes to the district so the district can pay their legal bills for battling Disney in court. But it wasn't just Disney that would be affected by these proposed tax hikes. A secondary group would be affected as well. These are people and businesses tied to the Disney resort. The most vulnerable group are the lessees at Disney Springs and elsewhere on Disney property. Increased taxes would almost surely affect their business model. Already, some restaurant owners have said that an increase in operating expenses related to higher tax rates could mean the difference between remaining profitable or operating at a loss. At an April 26th meeting of the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, which, moving forward, we will also call the CFTOD, owners of various restaurants on Disney property lined up to explain that raised taxes would impact their businesses. Among them were individuals and representatives of investment groups who owned Yak and Yeti at Animal Kingdom, Wine Bar George at Disney Springs, and San Angel Inn at Epcot. A representative from the Boathouse at Disney Springs explained that his restaurant paid $3.9 million in taxes last year, and that an increase would be problematic for his business, especially as his restaurant was already battling rising food costs. The framework for their comments overall was to inform the board that actions against business owners inside the district affected them, and that from their standpoint, they wished the board would open a dialogue with Disney to work through their differences. But there seemed little hope of this moving forward. The second group that may be affected by increased tax rates are DVC owners, who may see a rise in annual fees to account for the increased taxes. Presently, DVC owners with a minimum of 150 points, depending on their home resort, contribute around $200 in taxes per year. This has the potential of going up. To be clear, none of this has happened so far, but this is a real possibility that exists in the near future. And also to be clear, this would only happen in the Disney-centered special district, not in any of the other over 1,900 special districts elsewhere in Florida, including those that include a theme park. Universal, for example, sits within the Orlando Community Redevelopment District, and SeaWorld Orlando sits within a subdivision of the Convention Center District. Admittedly, Reedy Creek offered Disney greater advantages and control, but the legal elements that oversee the districts are similar to those elsewhere in the state. And this will be important later, that the state's primary focus is Disney, not all special districts that include large tourist attractions. This feud, particularly over raised taxes and unsavory uses of land near Disney, hasn't gone unnoticed by national politicians in Washington, D.C., as it frames DeSantis' management style and previews his bid for the presidency. During the last week of April, Republican Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy said that the Florida governor should sit down and negotiate with Disney. Why wouldn't you sit down and negotiate and talk? He said on the cable show Squawk Box, if there's differences, you can always find ways that you can solve this problem. I don't think the idea of building a prison next to a place you bring your family is the best idea. In other words, McCarthy was suggesting, though DeSantis' tactics might play well to the base, they weren't playing well on a national stage and might prove problematic moving forward. Other politicians considering or actually running for president jumped on the bandwagon to suggest that this fight with Disney wasn't going well. On a Semaphore interview, ex-New Jersey Governor Chris Christie said about DeSantis, "That's not the guy I want sitting across from President Xi, or sitting across from Putin, or trying to resolve what's happening in Ukraine, if you can't see around a corner Bob Iger created for you." About the proposed tax hike, he added, "I don't think Ron DeSantis is a conservative based on his actions towards Disney." Ex-President Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social that DeSantis is being absolutely destroyed by Disney. But of course, Trump as a candidate is incentivized to highlight his own accomplishments and point to the shortcomings of others also seeking the nomination. But this level of rhetoric also reframes the battle over Reedy Creek as one that largely exists in the realm of public opinion. DeSantis likely feels he needs to redeem himself in the eyes of the public and prove that he can manage and win complex battles if he has any hope of moving forward in the GOP primary. This past month, even other Republican-leaning pro-business states began to turn on him. On April 19th, North Carolina Senator Michael Garrett introduced the bill that he called Mickey's Freedom Restoration Act, which offered financial incentives to bring large theme parks like Disney to North Carolina. The bill, which references Disney and even Bob Iger, seeks to develop a plan to entice companies into building large theme parks in North Carolina and then devise financial incentives to bring them there. In support of this, another North Carolina Senator, Dan Blue, then tweeted, "Florida doesn't seem to be a good fit for the happiest place on earth these days. In North Carolina, y'all still means all." On April 20th, an article in Politico interviewed GOP lawmakers in Florida and published their statements anonymously in an attempt to gauge how much or how little support DeSantis presently had in his party concerning the issues with Disney. According to the article, most Republicans remained supportive, but a few were growing uncomfortable with DeSantis's focus on the Disney resort. "We're not the party of cancel culture," one GOP lawmaker said. "We can't keep doing this tit for tat." Also on April 20th, Disney launched a web page called The Value of Reedy Creek to Florida, which offered its opinion as to what the district brought to the state in terms of roads, jobs, and attractions, but also corrected some common misconceptions, such as Disney was tax-exempt, or, as DeSantis often suggested, that Disney didn't pay taxes similar to those of other companies. The page outlined that Disney had paid a combined total of $1.146 billion in state and local taxes, making Disney the largest single taxpayer in Central Florida. The following day, when speaking to the Heritage Foundation, DeSantis tried to both reframe his position and respond to the criticism he found in Washington, D.C. He defined himself as generally pro-business, even if he was working to limit Disney's authority in Central Florida. "It's not conservative to simply defer to every corporation in America," he said. "That's being a corporatist." In the days that followed, the board of the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District discussed the possibility of declaring the February 8th agreement between Reedy Creek and Disney void. Those were the contracts in which the previous board had guaranteed Disney's future planning rights and also limited the type of non-Disney developments the district would pursue on its own. Among the board's reasons was this: that earlier Reedy Creek board did not fully inform the public of their intent or of their meetings. Also, that the development agreement and restrictive covenants were essentially one-sided, wholly benefiting Disney without reasonable contractual consideration given to the board. As this drama was playing out in Central Florida, up in Tallahassee, legislatures attached a provision to the transportation bill that would require the state to inspect the monorail system at Disney World. The bill didn't identify Disney by name, but instead created a category in which Disney was the only member. If passed, the state could inspect, and here I'll quote, "governmental or privately owned fixed guideway transportation systems operating in the state which are located within an independent special district created by a local act which have boundaries within 2 contiguous counties." And within that incredibly specific definition would only exist Disney. Disney had at least one fixed guideway system, they were located in a special district, and their special district covered 2 contiguous counties, Orange and Osceola. The intent here seems to be to have inspection control of the monorail, but also the phrase fixed guideway transportation system might or might not also apply to the Skyliner. This, too, seemed to be hastily moved through the legislature so that it was unsure exactly what it did or did not cover. And this generally was the path that I thought most of the spring would follow, that the legislature would subtly arrange laws that would target Disney without explicitly mentioning the company by name, by creating categories which only fit Disney. Along with those 2 contiguous counties definition, there were still a number of ways to indicate Disney without saying Disney, such as the legislature could require state building inspections for amusement companies who own over 20,000 acres in a state. That, I think, would only be Disney. There might be unique hotel taxes for companies who manage over 30,000 hotel rooms. Again, only Disney. There could be unique requirements for a private company that employs over 50,000 individuals within a special district. Again, this would only be Disney. But then the following day, the gloves came off. On April 26th, the Central Florida Tourism Oversight Board moved to approve reports that would lead to the nullification of the February 8th contracts between Reedy Creek and Disney. Factually and legally, what Reedy Creek created is an absolute mess, board member Ron Garcia explained, and it will not work. The result of this vote was to move control of large areas of the Disney business model, including future planning deals, back under the board's dominion. Officially, the vote pushed forward a motion for a legal team to strike the previous agreements from public record and would ultimately give board members wide latitude in terms of how they could rule. This was clearly the trigger moment that Disney had been waiting for. They already had a lengthy lawsuit ready to file. Most likely the suit, or different versions of the suit, contained contingencies for how the CFTOD board might act. Within an hour of the board meeting, Disney finalized the suit and filed it in federal court. The 70-plus page lawsuit is available online and seems not only to be written to engage legal action, but also to sway public opinion. That is, it's one of the most readable suits I've seen. Simply, Disney knows that the suit will be read by some members of the public, and they've arranged its presentation so that it's easy to follow for non-lawyers in an attempt to frame public opinion. The suit names individuals, including Ron DeSantis, along with the new board members, as defendants, and this will be important later. It presents Disney's opinion as to how their statements about House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights in Education Act, which is protected speech, led to governmental retaliation from which individuals and corporations are legally shielded. The suit referred to many statements made by Governor DeSantis and other elected officials. Taken together, these statements presented a compelling case that multiple government acts were a type of retaliation, such as Florida Representative Spencer Roach's admission, "If Disney wants to embrace woke ideology, it seems fitting that they should be regulated by Orange County." The suit also included statements by Senator Broxson, a Republican from Pensacola. "We joined with the government in saying it was Disney's decision to go from apolitical, safe 25,000 acres to try to be involved in public policy. We're saying, you have changed the terms of our agreement, therefore, we'll put some authority around what you do." The suit continued to explain that in Disney's opinion, governmental action was arranged specifically to target their company and resort and to weaponize the power of government to punish private business. It also pointed to DeSantis's published memoir, which connected governmental action as a type of retaliation for Disney speech. This is from a section of DeSantis's book quoted in the lawsuit. "Nobody saw it coming," DeSantis wrote, "and Disney did not have enough time to put its army of high-powered lobbyists to work to try to derail the bill. That the legislature agreed to take it up would have been unthinkable a few months before. Disney had clearly crossed the line in its support of indoctrinating very young school children in woke gender identity politics." From there, Disney lawyers explained that to protect Disney's ability to develop its resort, the company openly entered into contracts with what was previously called the Reedy Creek Board to secure paths for future growth, plans that would help both Disney and also Reedy Creek, as well as the surrounding region, through increased tourism, thousands of new jobs, and additional tax payments. Again, from the lawsuit, the contracts followed public notices in the Orlando Sentinel, Orlando's primary newspaper with readership in the hundreds of thousands, and discussion at public hearings. That is, Disney explained that it followed the required protocol to create these binding agreements that the new board unilaterally wanted to dissolve. The suit asked for 5 actions to make Disney whole. The first cause was to enforce the existing contracts, specifically the developers agreement and the restrictive covenants. These were the contracts put in place on February 8th. The suit refers to the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, known as the Contracts Clause. Again from the lawsuit, the Contracts Clause provides that no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. The Contracts Clause prohibits local government entities from abrogating their own contracts with private entities. This appears to be Disney's strongest and therefore first approach. This action would not remove the new CFTOD board, but require the new board to honor the existing contracts, even if those contracts were arranged in the final weeks when the previous board had power. The second cause of action explains that in voiding the contracts, the new board has taken a type of intangible yet valuable property from Disney without compensation. This, according to the suit, violates the taking clause of the Fifth Amendment. That is, the rights Disney previously and legally held to develop its land in certain agreed ways had a large financial value. Again from the lawsuit, contract rights are a form of property, and as such may be taken for a public purpose provided that just compensation is paid. The development agreement, for example, grants Disney various long-term rights in the use and development of this land. The legislative declaration expressly deprives Disney of those valuable rights in private property without making any payment to Disney in exchange for this deprivation. In short, the bond took away something of great value from Disney without paying Disney for its value. The third cause of action refers to due process. As the suit has already defined contract rights as a type of valuable property, the suit then asserts that not only did the board take these rights without compensation, they took them without due process. Again from the suit, the due process clause forbids any state or local entity from adopting any arbitrary or irrational legislative act affecting a person's state-created rights, including property interests. States must demonstrate that they are violating interest only as necessary to promote state interests. That is, although the state in some cases may seize private property, including various rights for property, it must follow a process where it demonstrates that the property, including rights over property, are necessary for the good of the state. And even if some aspect of these rights is necessary for the interest of the state, a governing body can only acquire those specific elements for a specific goal, not invalidate the entire contract. Again from the suit, the CFTOD does not and cannot demonstrate that complete abrogation of the contracts is reasonably necessary to advance any state interest that could be legitimate. The fourth cause of action concerns Disney's First Amendment rights. This action suggests that the CFTOD board's motivation to invalidate the Reedy Creek contract was tied to the state's earlier efforts to retaliate against Disney for its speech. From the suit, CFTOD's actions were motivated by retaliatory intent. On April 17th, Governor DeSantis warned that the CFTOD board would be meeting a few days later to make sure that Disney is held accountable. Later that day, Governor DeSantis announced, "I look forward to the additional actions that the state control board will implement in the upcoming days." Governor DeSantis has let no doubt be harbored as to the impetus for his punishment. He wrote in an article to promote his book, When corporations try to use their economic power to advance a woke agenda, they become political, not merely economic actors. Leaders must stand up and fight back when big corporations make the mistake, as Disney did, of using their economic might to advance a political agenda. To put this simply, this section requests that, as a result, Disney is entitled to a declaratory judgment that the legislative declaration is unconstitutional and an order enjoining the defendants from creating it. Simply, that the move to void the development agreement, restrictive covenants, and other actions were specifically tied to a coordinated effort to use governmental powers to punish Disney for its political views expressed in speech, which is expressly forbidden in the First Amendment. The final action again refers to a First Amendment violation, though in this case it refers to the initial disagreement. Ex-CEO Bob Chapek's comments about House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights in Education Act, also known as the Don't Say Gay Bill, which, according to this suit, led to political retribution, first through a bill to dissolve Reedy Creek and a subsequent bill to create the CFTOD. And here I should point out that a lawyer has suggested that though this request is compelling, it is slightly weakened because Disney waited over a year to put it forward. This may be why this First Amendment issue is listed fifth and is the last action. From the suit, Disney has a significant interest in its governing body's composition and structure, which has been directly targeted by the enactment of legislation providing for its complete revisions. Disney faces concrete, imminent, and ongoing injury as a result of CFTOD's new powers and composition. That is, the suit claims that the two bills that ultimately led to the creation of the CFTOD were motivated by retaliatory intent to punish Disney for its stance on House Bill 1557, which is protected political speech. Corporate protected speech means that though individuals may choose to boycott a company or publicly critique that company's stance, a government body is prohibited from using its powers to retaliate for a position held by that company. The suit then points to the unusual circumstances that led to the passing of these bills, including unique support by the governor, who overtly tied this bill to his dislike of Disney's speech. Because these bills, in transforming Reedy Creek into the CFTOD, were framed as retaliation for Disney's speech, the suit asks, and again I quote here, Disney is entitled to a declaratory judgment that the laws are unconstitutional and an order enjoining defendants from enforcing them. In this, Disney opens the possibility that the new board be invalidated, as its creation was based on unconstitutional legislation, and that a likely remedy here would be to reinstate Reedy Creek and perhaps even remove any policy decisions made by the CFTOD board while it was in power. The suit asks that the defendants, which include DeSantis, are issued an order to prevent them from enforcing key legislative declarations and bills. I believe this means the bills can stay on the books, but they can't be enforced. Finally, the suit asks that the defendants, which again includes DeSantis, pay the plaintiffs, meaning Disney's, attorney fees and costs. That, I believe, is one reason the suit is presented to individuals rather than to the CFTOD, as it creates the possibility of financial liability for entities other than the special district, which Disney largely funds through taxes. In terms of remedies, depending on how the court views each request, a judge might remove the CFTOD board entirely, or a judge might allow for the CFTOD board to remain while honoring the Reedy Creek development and covenants contracts. A court might also side against Disney, leaving both the CFTOD board in place and also allowing them to nullify the Reedy Creek development and covenants contracts. At the time the lawsuit was filed, Ron DeSantis was in South Korea as part of a week-long trip to build Florida's economic relationships concerning trade with multiple countries. He met with government officials there, including the Prime Minister. News of the Disney lawsuit dropped at noon in New York, Washington, D.C., and Florida, which meant that, as South Korea was 13 hours ahead, almost surely DeSantis was asleep. This gave reporters the afternoon and evening, including anchors on the evening news, to focus on the Disney suit before DeSantis had an opportunity to respond. Disney lawyers could not have hoped for better timing, as the initial narrative would define the suit without DeSantis appearing on TV. DeSantis didn't respond until the following day when he was in Israel as part of that same economic tour. "I don't think the suit has merit," he said. "I think it's political." He also explained that Disney has no accountability, no transparency, none of that, and that arrangement was not good for the state of Florida. "We did not think that should continue, so we have now brought accountability." In this, DeSantis again shifted his rhetoric about the issue, which had been previously tied to a type of retribution for Disney's speech about a Florida law, to concerns about Disney's ability to influence local government in Reedy Creek. This almost surely sets up the forthcoming court battle, in that DeSantis may pivot to a position where he is primarily critical of Disney's influence over the previous Reedy Creek board, even though he appeared satisfied with that arrangement for years until Disney spoke out against a House bill. But this shift would move the focus from Disney's speech, which is protected by the First Amendment, to issues of government oversight, which may play better inside of a courtroom. After DeSantis offered his reaction, the Wall Street Journal asked a leading First Amendment lawyer, Floyd Abrams, about the strength of the Disney suit. "DeSantis has walked into a First Amendment conflict," Abrams said, "in which he's more likely than not to lose." Abrams compared this to a 1989 Florida case in which a government body wanted to cancel an advertising contract with a company whose views they disliked. "It's a case which concludes that government may not use its power to punish its critics," he said, suggesting that such precedents would favor Disney this time around. Though most Republicans in Florida publicly sided with DeSantis, at this point a few began to peel away. Senator Joe Gruters, a Republican from Sarasota, when referencing the battle, said, "The heavy hand of government was not an effective way to support our job creators." Though Representative Spencer Roach had initially agreed with the policy position of DeSantis, he also felt that the public was now losing patience with this battle. "I'm not sure at this point that the public is with us," he told the Wall Street Journal, "and I would urge the governor to be cautious as he goes on with this fight with Disney." But reconciliation with a company DeSantis called woke ran counter to the image he likely wanted to present to the American public in the months leading up to the primary. That he was a person who battled for what he believed in rather than compromise. In this, there's also a strange irony at play. DeSantis could have made a similar point by choosing a company not central to his state's economy. There are many companies that, largely due to market research, lean left and are housed on the West Coast. Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Nike, and so on, and DeSantis could have battled any of those without placing his state in a type of economic jeopardy. But that's simply not how the dialogue began between Bob Chapek and the state of Florida, and now we're in an odd situation in which the state is battling its largest single-site employer, a dispute that has no significant financial upside for either party. On April 27th, Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor, jumped on the bandwagon then being driven by North Carolina by inviting Disney to invest in her state as well. She mentioned this both on Fox and then posted a message to Disney on Twitter. "My home state will happily accept your 70,000 plus jobs if you want to leave Florida," she said. Then she added that South Carolina is not woke, but we're not sanctimonious about it either. And that word there, sanctimonious, was a key term that Trump had used for DeSantis, specifically with his nickname, Ron DeSanctimonious. In this, Nikki Haley may not have been looking to raise her polling numbers, as she was in the low single digits at that point, but she may have been aligning herself with Trump, possibly as his vice presidential running mate. During these same days, the transportation bill moved through the Florida legislature, the one that would require the state to inspect the monorails and perhaps even the Skyliner, depending on how you read various terms in that bill. It would take another week or so for this to be finished in the Senate and signed by the governor. If anything, this was an exertion of control, a shifting of oversight that had been in place for over half a century as a demonstration of the state's power. Over that weekend, the situation calmed down. But then on Monday, May 1st, the board decided to sue Disney as well, bringing a second suit into the legal system, though this one would be arranged in a slightly different manner. Martin Garcia, the chair of the new oversight district, said, "Disney sued us. We have no choice now but to respond. The district will seek justice in state court here in Central Florida, where both it and Disney reside and do business." The suit was to enforce the board's legislative findings that Reedy Creek's recent agreement with Disney over development and restrictive covenants was invalid. Specifically, the board wanted a court to officially declare the Reedy Creek Development Agreement and restrictive covenants void and issue an order enjoining Disney from enforcing them. If anything, this seemed to be preemptive because the board had already moved to invalidate them. So the board appeared to be suing so that a court would agree with their previous decision, which from a certain perspective looked unnecessary. Unnecessary unless Disney received a temporary injunction that limited the board's actions while the federal court case moved forward. Such an injunction may soon be requested and given. It just hasn't happened yet. But in this, the motivations for the CFTOD board to sue the state are unclear. If the federal court rules in Disney's favor, the state ruling will be irrelevant, as federal rulings supersede rulings at the state level. So the district suing in state court may ultimately be more about grandstanding than about actually creating policy. Perhaps the board believes that a ruling in state court in their favor may place pressure on a federal court to rule in the same way, but in terms of reaching an actual outcome, this state ruling has a significant chance of being meaningless once the federal case is decided. On May 2nd, the Wall Street Journal looped back to the Disney lawsuit, presenting an article in which Scott Wilkins, senior counsel at the Knight First Amendment Institute, was asked about the difficulties of proving motivation in First Amendment cases. These statements relate to the fourth and fifth causes of action in the Disney suit. Wilkins explained that in many cases it was difficult to prove motivation. You often have to make inferences about motives driving government officials, he explained. Then he said this was what made the Disney case remarkable. You have pretty clear statements from Governor DeSantis that he's seeking to punish a corporation for its speech. He then pointed to materials in DeSantis's book, and that book will play a unique role in the next few weeks as the suit moves forward. And then finally, on Friday, May 5th, the Florida governor signed into law State Bill 1604, a bill intended to retroactively invalidate the contract between Reedy Creek and Disney. The bill says that a special district does not need to comply with the terms of any development agreement or any other agreement for which the development agreement serves in whole or part as consideration which is executed within 3 months preceding the effective date of a law modifying the manner of selecting members of the governing body. And beyond this, the new board has 4 months to review and, if they want, readopt any recent agreements that suit them moving forward. In short, this means any new board can unilaterally dismiss any development contract it doesn't like that was arranged over the previous 3 months. I would imagine that Disney might need to expand its suit to include this material from Senate Bill 1604, but all of the areas here relate to those we've previously discussed, specifically how federal law prevents government bodies generally from dissolving contracts unilaterally, and when they do, there must be due process, an explanation of how the dissolution of one part of a contract serves a public good, and also payment for the value of property or those rights lost. None of that has happened here. There are a couple of unusual elements in all this. First, as this bill doesn't just apply to the CFTOD and Disney, it would allow any special district in Florida to walk away from various contracts they didn't like simply by changing the composition of the board. This should make vendors very wary about entering into various contracts with special districts. Second, this bill suggests that the contract between Disney and Reedy Creek was actually valid, and therefore needs a bill to invalidate it, which is in conflict from the views put forward by the CFTOD and DeSantis. Previously, the CFTOD and the governor suggested that the departing Reedy Creek board and Disney didn't create a valid contract. In this, one set of lawyers is not communicating very well with that other set of lawyers. But to get back to the Disney suit, which I believe is the most important development in terms of defining the future direction of this disagreement, the case will soon enter a discovery phase. Disney has attached 4 lawyers to this case, including Adam Colby Losey, who is an e-discovery expert. Losey's publications, such as in the Florida Law Review, are focused on electronic documents obtained during the discovery period of a trial. This suggests that one of his primary roles will be to request and assemble emails, texts, and other documents that help determine government intent. DeSantis's book and how it details who the governor talked to and worked with to develop these bills related to Reedy Creek will likely prove an initial roadmap for Losey to follow. In short, Losey now already knows, thanks to that book, which set of correspondence on which to focus to begin his work. The discovery process has the potential to be problematic for DeSantis in his bid for the presidency. Many public statements already frame his efforts towards Disney as government retaliation for protected political speech. But that book and previous statements are old news, at least right now. The discovery process will kick all of that into the news cycle again, and maybe something slightly more damaging might emerge. There might be an email that reveals that the governor knew he was acting outside of the framework of the First Amendment, or again, there might not. In all this, Disney will review its options as the case moves forward. If this becomes a protracted case, followed by appeals, and I believe that's the path we're going down, Disney may shift how it invests or doesn't invest in Florida. It may be advantageous for Disney to demonstrate how the political situation reduced possible growth in Florida. Now, let me put this up front. Despite the rhetoric in some newspapers, Disney is not leaving Florida. The Florida resort as it exists today has been built with 55 years of near continuous construction. Disney still needs to fill hotel rooms at the resort to be profitable. New attractions are the key to doing that. Disney is not going to walk away from a resort with over 50 years worth of investment. Also, Disney has recently invested deeply in its cruise line terminal in Florida. It would be costly to move the Florida port to another state, but Disney can still shift some capital investments in one or two directions that would make a political point to defining the company's value to Florida. The first is to lavish a little more attention on the California resort, quietly demonstrating how the Florida resort and the overall Florida tourist economy is missing out on a few opportunities. Disney has played one region against another in the past to bolster its own position. Specifically, in the 1990s, Disney played Anaheim against Long Beach, California, to determine where it would build its second West Coast park, hoping to encourage ongoing incentives from one of the two cities. Something like that might play out here. The other has to do with Universal's recent announcements. With Universal regionalizing its parks, that is, building smaller parks in Texas and Las Vegas, it might be attractive for Disney to do something similar. As we've discussed in previous episodes, Universal is using its 60-acre Texas park as a way to introduce kids to the Universal experience, something that, as they grow up, might lead them to the Universal parks in Florida as opposed to Disney. Disney could do the same by shifting some development dollars from Florida to other East Coast or Midwest venues. I doubt Disney has much interest in building a park the size of the Magic Kingdom anywhere in North America, but perhaps something smaller. A park in the Midwest focused on young children might prove a similar gateway experience that would eventually lead families to Disney World. Also, if Disney could find a location west of the Mississippi, they could create a small park with a Marvel element, as Universal only licenses Marvel's theme park rights for the eastern United States. That too might be attractive to Disney, as they presently can't build such experiences in Florida. I fully admit that these are extreme examples, but they exist now as a possibility in a way they did not 6 months ago. And again, though I have no interest in making this into a political podcast, it's a show that analyzes the current state of the Disney company. Disney presently finds itself embroiled in political and legal discussions, a set of cases that will help shape how Disney expands its Florida resort in the near future, and also creates a context for what it might build in other states as well. And this story, of course, will continue to play out in the months ahead. I'll be back next week with a new episode. But having so much material unfold around the saga of Reedy Creek over the past 10 days has thrown off how I imagined our schedule for May. Up until the last week of April, I had assumed the Reedy Creek segment would be about 20 minutes, that we would have a regular news magazine show with multiple topics, and that the Reedy Creek elements would be only one of them. But it took 45 minutes to explore everything that needed to be explored with Reedy Creek. At least right now, on Saturday afternoon, I'm thinking that I will fill out the other monthly news stories next week, particularly as this episode here has mostly been focused on Florida. Oh, one more thing. Today we discussed how theme parks, particularly Universal, are regionalizing their experience with smaller parks. This is not a new idea. Walt himself considered this exact thing, with very specific plans for years. If you search back through the Bandcamp offerings, you will find 2 episodes called Project Satellite and Project Spring that explore Walt's plans in the early 1960s to do just this. Lastly, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things. We do deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. If you enjoy this show, if you tune in most weeks, you can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, including those episodes about Project Satellite and Project Spring. There is a large collection of material on Bandcamp that explains and explores the history of the parks, the films, the studio, and the people who work there, including many shows that have never been released elsewhere. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. So, if you're one of our regular listeners, please join us over on Bandcamp in supporting this show. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave the usual link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.